Many people find the human mind to be quite interesting. We like to read about the range of emotions the mind produces, the perceptions the mind is capable of, and the behaviors that the mind engages in. And when we study the mind, we tend to study what is typical, how it ordinarily functions, or what we're going to most commonly see. But like anything else, the mind can deviate. The mind can go from what is outside the typical normal range and engage in abnormalities. And just how psychologists study the normal functioning of the brain or the mind, or psychiatrists or neurologists, so too do psychologists, neurologists, psychologists study the deviations of the mind, just in the same way that they would study the typical functioning of the mind. And this is the field that's called abnormal psychology, or clinical psychiatry, or clinical neurology. So in this video, we're going to explore some books that cover the topic of psychiatry or abnormal psychology. The first book is Madness Explained: Psychosis in Human Nature by Richard P Bentall. The aim of this book is to challenge the conventional wisdom aimed at psychiatric diagnosis and their underlying causes. For example, Bentall argues that the diagnosis of schizophrenia has been oversimplified and that there is more to schizophrenia than just the underlying biological factors, which have become the heavy emphasis of modern research on schizophrenia. He highlights how social factors like adverse childhood experiences, isolation, and trauma can actually either induce or be a very strong predictor of the onset of psychosis. An example, the ACE score, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences score, which encompasses emotional neglect, household dysfunction, and physical abuse, are heavily correlated with a range of mental health problems, but in particular psychosis as well. There's in fact one famous study that found children or adults who report a higher ACE score, but also just an ACE score in general, are actually more likely to report psychotic symptoms. There was also another study that simply looked at childhood adverse experiences, not necessarily an ACE score, but just maltreatment, and found that those who received maltreatment were also more likely to experience psychotic symptoms. This book, like many other books in psychiatry, at least in modern publishing, also explores how cultural norms impact the perception of mental illness, as well as diagnosis of mental illness. Bentall explores the notion of cultural bound syndromes, which is the idea that in one culture you have a diagnosis of a set of behaviors that is considered a mental illness, but those set of behaviors would not be considered a mental illness in another culture. One great example is auditory hallucinations or hearing voices. In some cultures, when you hear a voice, it is considered a spiritual experience, but in many Western cultures, it is pathologized and it is considered a mental health issue. A more interesting one is found in Japan, and I'm not going to pronounce it because I'm going to butcher it, but basically the idea is that there is a fear of offending somebody through your body odor or appearance, and so they're hyper vigilant about their body odor or their appearance and their manners as well, so that they don't offend other people. So what Bentall is arguing is that psychosis is not just a brain disorder, it is a complex interplay between the brain, the environment, and genetics. The next book is The Disordered Mind: What Unusual Brains Tell Us About Ourselves. The goal of the book is to look at disorders that are involved with the brain, such as depression or schizophrenia, and consider their neural mechanisms and the greater impact on who we are as people. For starters, Kandel considers neurotransmitter systems and how their dysfunction, such as the serotonin dysfunction in depression, can contribute to things like mood disorders. Another great example of a mood disorder involving dysfunctions in neurotransmitter systems is bipolar disorder. In bipolar disorder, there is evidence of dopamine signaling being, for lack of a better word, messed up. During the manic phases of bipolar disorder, it is an increase in dopamine, and when there's a depressive phase of bipolar disorder, it is a decrease in dopamine. Another neurotransmitter that has been implicated in mood disorders, in specific anxiety or generalized anxiety, is GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that basically decreases or calms neural activity. Basically, a decrease in GABA function can lead to general neural excitability, which then leads to anxiety or stress. He also discusses how dysfunctions in neural circuits can lead to imbalances in behavior in specific obsessive-compulsive disorder. Or in the case of schizophrenia, there is disruptions in the dopamine signaling for both the mesolimbic pathway, which is a reward pathway, or the mesocortical pathway, which is a cognitive function pathway. And then, of course, towards the end of the book, he explores the interplay between genetics and environment. He discusses things like autism spectrum disorder and how prenatal stress can actually induce it. On top of that, how prenatal stress can actually make some of the symptoms of someone who already has autism spectrum disorder even worse. He also discusses a piece of research that I think is very interesting, but you have to be careful with interpreting. And the claim is that living in urban environments increases the onset or likelihood of schizophrenia. Or in other words, people who are living in urban environments get schizophrenia at an earlier age and are more likely to have schizophrenia. So the next book is Doctoring the Mind: Why Psychiatric Treatments Fail, and this book is also by Richard P Bentall. If it wasn't already obvious enough from the subheader of the book is meant to critique the current diagnosis and treatment plans of psychiatric treatment that we have today. In a similar vein to Kandel or Bentall's last book, he basically challenges the heavy biological emphasis in psychiatry and switches more towards this idea that there is an environmental factor that needs to be considered, even if the biological factor should also be considered. You can't exclude the environmental factor. And he argues for things like urban upbringing having an influence on the development or onset of schizophrenia. He also goes into a more interesting development in genetics research that explores the role of developing mental health problems in relation to social class and genetics, basically looking at it all together and looking at how things like poverty plus genetics can actually lead to mental illness. So, of course, he's also then going to proceed to argue that we should have a classification system that's a little bit more encompassing or a little bit more holistic, that doesn't only focus on biological treatments, are then treated with chemical responses. Now, what is a little bit more interesting that I don't see too commonly done with these types of books is he explores the impact of individual psychology on the actual treatment programs. For example, he explores that patients' beliefs or expectations about a particular medication can actually heavily influence its efficacy. And in a similar fashion, there is this thing called the nocebo effect, where something like the beliefs that a patient has about the outcome of a treatment program can actually lead to them mitigating any effects that is going to happen from the treatment program. And then he also argues that we should move towards a more individualistic model of medicine, which is quite the trend now in medicine. And he argues that, for example, the DSM is, although a good backbone, has a terrible tendency to not accurately characterize the individual experiences of patients. The next book is Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. And the book basically argues that on the one hand, psychiatry has engaged in overdiagnosis, and on the other hand, pharmaceutical companies have had too much influence in psychiatric treatment. One great example of this that he starts off is when you get to the DSM-5, we have an expansion and a more nuanced definition of ADHD, and it encompasses, you could say, a wider spectrum. He argues that this might actually lead to overdiagnosis and then, as a result, giving more medication as well. He also talks about how some people might not benefit from certain environments, such as a formalized classroom, and that they might not actually have ADHD, it's just that they don't do well in certain environments, but our response is to diagnose them and medicate them. Two other examples would be depression and bereavement. I believe depression had an expansion in its classification or definition or diagnosis criteria in the DSM-5, and bereavement now runs the risk of being classified as a major depressive disorder when it is in fact not, it is just bereavement. It's what he says is in the normal range of variation. He also talks about the influence of pharmaceutical companies, that the influence they've had on psychiatric treatment plans, guidelines for prescribing medication, and actual diagnosis. To elaborate, he highlights how pharmaceutical companies have downplayed negative findings about their drugs, but then also marketed and promoted off-brand use, or off-purpose use, basically using a medication for an unintended purpose, claiming that even though it's not intended for this purpose, it has benefits that can be conferred if you use it for the secondary purpose. And companies will do that even when there is no evidence to support that offhand use. One famous example of this is Pfizer promoting the off-brand use of Neurontin, was its brand name. I think it's gabapentin something. I don't know how to pronounce it. And what they did was they had their sales representatives encourage off-label uses of this medication, despite that there was no evidence for it, for things like bipolar disorder, migraines, or chronic pain, or something like this. And then the same thing, not nearly the same thing, but pretty similar, happened with Johnson & Johnson. It happened with Johnson & Johnson, and basically they were encouraging the use of a drug at events that they sponsored. They literally sponsored marketing events, big get-togethers, conferences, where their sales representatives then pushed onto psychiatrists off-label uses for a particular drug that didn't have a lot of evidence for it. And they gained a lot of money. I think it was like the sales was in the billions, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but I believe it was $2 billion they gained from this in sales. And they had to make a settlement with the US Department of Justice, I think in 2014. So they also were caught doing this. Those are probably going to be the 4 books I recommend for reading psychiatry, just as like a general overview. It gets both into the actual clinical practice, but also the politics and economics of the industry. With that being said, guys, let me know if you have any books you can recommend me on this topic. I have more. I'll make another video in the future, but bye for now.